Hi everyone, and today I'm excited to be testing out a lens that I've wanted since I read its announcement over 3 years ago, the Mitakon Speedmaster 50mm f/0.95. It's a manual focus lens which is currently only for Sony's full-frame mirrorless E-mount cameras. It will not adapt onto a digital SLR camera at all. This is the newer version of the lens, known as the Pro version or Dark Knight version. You can tell by its filter thread size of 67mm, whereas the original version, which is supposedly not as good, has a 58mm filter thread. Anyway, let me tell you why I'm so excited about this lens. For a long time, it was a dream of mine to own a copy of the legendary Canon EF 50mm f1, another ultra-fast 50mm lens, and it's still a dream of mine to review one of those lenses. If any of my subscribers in the UK know somebody who could lend me one for testing, then please let me know. On a full-frame camera, shooting at 50mm with an aperture as wide as f1 will give you stunning, unique-looking pictures that leap right out at you. Even working professional photographers rarely use lenses which give such a narrow depth of field, yet fairly wide background, as this. Even if you were to use a medium format camera, you'd have trouble emulating this look, as medium format lenses don't tend to have very fast maximum apertures, although who knows what the future may hold there. Not only is the artistic effect stunning, but the sheer amount of light such a lens is transmitting to your camera is astonishing at such wide apertures, effectively allowing you to shoot still images or video in even the darkest of conditions. Anyway, a few things put me off saving up to buy a Canon EF 50mm f1. In sample images you can find on the internet, the actual quality of its bokeh doesn't look too pleasant to me, and it shows crazy flaring against bright lights. It's a hard lens to find as it's discontinued, and Canon don't make parts for it anymore. So if I bought one and it broke, then I'd be in huge trouble, especially as it has a fully electronic focus system. And finally, on a second-hand market, it currently costs between £3,000 and £4,000, or about $4,000 to $5,000. I can't justify that. Aside from anything else, my mum would kill me. Cut to 2017. I've just bought a full-frame mirrorless camera, a Sony a7R II, so in comes Exhibit A, the Mitakon 50mm f/0.95. Unlike the Canon lens, I'm stuck having to focus manually, which is a shame. But from all the sample pictures I've seen on the internet, I'm getting a lens here with apparently far smoother bokeh and just as much sharpness with the bits that are in focus, a lens whose maximum aperture is even a whisker wider at f/0.95 and whose electronics cannot break, because it doesn't have any, and a lens which only costs £700 or around $800 US. Still a lot of money, but 700 goes into 4,000 quite a number of times. Actually, I got this one 25% off on a Black Friday sale. Sweet. Oh, and because my Sony a7R II has in-body image stabilization and Canon cameras do not, this lens can be nicely image stabilized. I love living in 2017. Don't forget to program your camera's stabilization to 50mm. This lens doesn't communicate anything to your camera, including focal length. Well now, let's take a look at the lens's build quality. It comes packaged in a very nice faux leather two-tone box, which looks the business. Out of the box, it feels solid and metallic, weighing 720 grams. This thing is jam-packed with glass. But it's not too big, considering its huge aperture. It balances nicely on my a7R II. The aperture ring is at the top of the lens and turns smoothly, which is fine, but I far prefer an aperture ring with clicks. However, it turns fairly heavily rather than loosely, so accidentally changing the aperture doesn't happen too often. The focus ring turns very smoothly and a little heavily. It turns about 160 degrees in total, which might sound like a lot, but it's only just precise enough for focusing at f/0.95. A hyperfocal scale is etched into the lens's body. A quick word on focusing at f/0.95, it's obviously not easy with that tiny, narrow depth of field, but with a little practice and a subject that isn't moving much, you'll be fine. Personally, I always use magnification to zoom in and adjust focus before unmagnifying and recomposing my picture. That always works nicely for me. If you've never used a manual focus lens before though, you will need to practice a little. The more narrow a depth of field a lens can give you, the greater the challenge to focus correctly, but the greater the rewards can be. I should also note for you that, while this is an f/0.95 lens, you do get accordingly amazingly out of focus backgrounds, but in my tests I found that the light transmission is only about T1.3 or so it's more of a lens for people whose priority is narrow depth of field. Finally, Mitakon have put out an official lens hood which costs about $20, although it came free with my copy of the lens. It's decently deep and made of plastic, but it has a lovely brushed effect on the outside which feels nice and looks good, and it has flocking on the inside to further reduce reflections. It doesn't clip into place when fixed, instead just tightening into place, but it does stay on very solidly. Overall, if you're happy to focus manually, you should be very happy with the lens's build quality. So, image quality. This should be interesting, especially as I'm going to test it on a 42 megapixel full frame camera, a Sony a7R II. Now then, in the middle of the image at f/0.95, even on a 42 megapixel camera, there's a sharp sweet spot. However, contrast is rather low here, and there's some visible chromatic aberration. Still, with a bit of sharpening and extra contrast, you'll get a good image. Over in the corners, we see softness and blurring in the very edges and a lot of darkness from vignetting. I thought it might be worse than this though. Stop down to f1.4 for a little more clarity, but it's back in the middle of the image that we see the real improvement, with a big boost in contrast. At f2, image quality in the middle is great, although the corners are still struggling. However, at f2.8, those corners look reasonably good, and at f4, they're really sharp. They remain this sharp down to about f8. Stop all the way down to f16 though, and some softness is creeping in from diffraction. So, on a full frame camera, well, what do you think? I found that at f/0.95, the sweet spot of sharpness in the middle of the image was more than enough for me and my narrow depth of field pictures if I added a little contrast. It's a shame that the corners of the image are so weak at those wider apertures, but then again, if you're taking a landscape picture or otherwise need corner sharpness, you can always stop down to f4 or f8 for some very impressive results, even on a 42 megapixel camera. Well, I'll also test this lens on an APS-C camera for you, where it's the full frame equivalent of a 75mm lens with a depth of field of about f1.5, still an attractive proposition. I'll be testing on a 24 megapixel Sony a5100. At f/0.95, in the middle of the image, again there is some decent resolution, but the murky contrast and colourful chromatic aberration is further emphasised by the slightly more demanding APS-C sensor. The corners are terrible. They remain terrible at f1.4, but image quality in the middle is greatly improved. At f2, the image quality is great there, but the corners are still pretty dreadful. f2.8, f4, f5.6 is a bit clearer, f8 is about the same. You get the picture, no pun intended. To be honest, I'd just say that this lens is unsuitable really for use on an APS-C camera. So that's image quality at normal distances, but the lens can focus as closely as 50 centimeters. How is the close-up image quality? At f/0.95, close-up image quality is appalling, just about the worst I have seen. The ghosting on contrasting edges is extreme. f1.4 is still pretty bad, f2 is better, and finally at f2.8, close-up image quality is sharp. Still a bit disappointing. Okay, how about distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera? The lens projects a moderate barrel distortion, which may be visible in some pictures. At f/0.95, unsurprisingly, vignetting is very strong in the corners, they're pretty dark there. At f1.4, there's a small improvement. At f2, the vignetting is mostly cleared up, and at f2.8, it's essentially gone. On my camera, turning on in-camera corrections made no difference to my images. Let's see how the lens works against bright light. Whoa, that flaring is some of the wildest I've seen. You will definitely want to invest in getting a lens hood and using it. Finally, bokeh, a crucial question for a lens like this. Very often, I found the bokeh looking pretty nice and smooth actually, at whatever aperture I was using. Very pleasing. Here's another example at f0.95, but here you can see some curious behaviour. There's very soft bokeh in the middle, even with bright points of light. It's almost like the lens has an apodization filter within it, which it doesn't. But around the edges, physical vignetting is giving a cat's eye shape to those out of focus points of light. If you stop down to f1.4, then the bokeh generally evens out, and now looks very typical for such a lens. Here's the same image at f2.8. The bokeh characteristic of this lens is fascinating to me. It's certainly quirky. Personally, I like it. It's smooth enough when I need it to be. Related to bokeh, it's worth noting that this lens has a bit of a serious problem with longitudinal chromatic aberration, which you can see here. Green in the background, purple in the foreground. It's worst at f0.95, but gets better as you stop the aperture down. Anyway, overall, the Mitakon 50mm f0.95 has a whole host of strengths and weaknesses which some will be put off by, and some will be happy to work around. It's a manual focus lens, so not always easy to use, but aside from that, the build quality is really nice. In its images, contrast could be better at f0.95, but that's only on strongly contrasting edges, and it's always easy to add contrast in editing. Vignetting and distortion are typical for a fast 50mm lens. Close-up image quality and work against bright light are disastrous at wide apertures. However, the lens has nice enough neutral colours. It's capable to get a nice sharp image in the middle at f0.95, and it gets very sharp when the aperture is topped down. The quality of the lens's bokeh is also very nice in my opinion, and that's a winning combination to me. Sharpness and good bokeh. At the end of the day, this is a lens that many photographers, including myself, dream of using because its images can be so striking. As another reviewer on YouTube has put it, in a very strong Dutch accent, it's either a lens you'll love or hate. Personally, I love it, and for those who are happy to work within this lens's limitations, I recommend it.